Housed within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is a limestone stele, a stone slab standing just over a meter tall. It was unearthed in 1896 by the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie amidst the ruins of Thebes. Upon its surface, carved with meticulous, almost millimetric precision, are hieroglyphic inscriptions dating to approximately 1208 BC. It is known as the Merneptah Stele, and for decades, it was largely overlooked by biblical researchers. That was until someone noticed something remarkable in the 27th line. There, amidst a list of peoples conquered by the pharaoh Merneptah, the name Israel appears for the very first time in any known non-biblical record. A single mention, yet a mention that would change everything. For if Israel already existed as a distinct people in the year 1208 BC, and it logically follows that the Exodus, the liberation from Egypt, must have taken place before this date. And as historians began to trace the timeline backwards, they uncovered something that no one had anticipated. The numbers simply did not align. Open the Bible to chapter 12 of the Book of Exodus, verse 40. There, the statement is unequivocal, with no apparent metaphor. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. 430 years. A precise figure. Not an approximation. Not symbolic, at least not on the surface. This number should be the key to constructing an accurate chronology of the Hebrew people in Egypt. And yet, the moment one attempts to apply this number to actual history, a fissure appears. A small crack at first, but one that widens with every new line of inquiry. Let us begin at the beginning. According to the biblical text, Abraham arrived in Canaan, and his descendants subsequently ended up in Egypt with Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers. According to the Bible's own internal chronology, this occurs in approximately the 18th or 17th century BC. If we add 430 years from that point, we arrive at an Exodus around the 14th or 13th century BC. This time frame aligns roughly with the reign of Ramesses II, who lived from 1279 to 1213 BC. This is the version that permeates popular culture. It appears in films, in television documentaries, and in religious textbooks. Ramesses II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. But there is a problem, and the 430 years is not the only number in the story. When you open the book of Genesis and begin to count the generations from Jacob, the patriarch who entered Egypt with his family, to Moses, the man who led them out, you find something disconcerting. There are only 4 generations. Jacob fathered Levi, Levi fathered Kohath, Kohath fathered Amram, and Amram fathered Moses. 4 generations. How much time does that represent in historical terms? In human biology, an average generation spans 25 to 30 years. 4 generations would therefore equate to between 100 and 120 years. Not 430. This is not a matter of interpretation. These are the numbers presented by the biblical text itself, placed side by side. Historians who specialize in Old Testament chronology have been debating this problem for more than a century. In 1901, the German scholar Eduard Meyer published an exhaustive analysis of biblical chronology in his work, Die Israeliten und ihre Nachbarstämme, the Israelites and their neighboring tribes. Meyer pointed out that the contradiction between the 430 years and the 4-generation genealogy could not be easily resolved with literalist arguments. Other researchers followed. In 1955, the American archaeologist John Bright published a history of Israel, in which he attempted to reconcile both timelines with archaeological data? He could not. The problem remained immovable, like the Merneptah Stele itself. But the matter becomes even more complex when you compare versions of the same biblical text in different languages. The original Hebrew text, known as the Masoretic Text, clearly states 430 years in Egypt. But the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made in Alexandria around the 3rd century BC, offers a different reading. In the Greek version, the verse in Exodus 12:40 contains a startling addition. The Greek text reads, "The time that the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt and in the land of Canaan was 430 years." Did you see that? Egypt and Canaan. This is no minor detail. If the 430 years includes the time the patriarchs lived in Canaan before entering Egypt, then the actual duration of their stay on Egyptian soil would be considerably shorter. One would have to subtract the years that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob spent in Canaan. According to the internal chronology of Genesis, that period could be between 200 and 215 years. This would leave the actual time in Egypt at approximately 215 years. And 215 years is compatible with a 4-generation genealogy. 2 versions of the same biblical text. 2 different numbers. A discrepancy of more than 2 centuries. How did we end up with 2 such distinct versions of such a specific verse? To understand this, one must understand how sacred texts were transmitted in antiquity. Manuscripts were not printed. They were copied by hand, year after year, century after century. Each copy was produced by a scribe, working in conditions we can now scarcely imagine. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, in rooms either frigid or stifling, transcribing characters in languages they did not always master perfectly. The Septuagint was translated in Alexandria, Egypt, probably between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC. At that time, Alexandria was the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Its famous library, according to historical records, housed between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls. The translators of the Septuagint were Hellenized Jews, people who spoke Greek as their first language, but who had access to Hebrew and Aramaic texts older than those that have survived to this day. This is crucial. When the Septuagint adds the phrase, "and in the land of Canaan," modern researchers are forced to ask, were they translating from a different Hebrew text than the one we know? Or were they interpreting and clarifying a text they themselves found ambiguous? The Apostle Paul quotes the 430 years in his letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 17. But he does so in a peculiar way. Paul states that the law was given 430 years after the promise made to Abraham, not 430 years after the entry into Egypt. 430 years from Abraham. This would imply the clock started ticking long before Jacob set foot in Egypt. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century AD and had access to archives that no longer exist, wrote in his Antiquities of the Jews that the Israelites left Egypt 430 years after their ancestor Abraham arrived in Canaan, not 430 years in Egypt. 430 years from Abraham. Josephus concurs with Paul, but neither of them aligns with the literal reading of the Masoretic Text. Who was right? Or perhaps we're all three looking at different versions of the same original text. The Masoretic Text, which forms the basis of most modern Bibles, was finalized by the Masoretic scribes between the 6th and 10th centuries AD. This means that the standardized Hebrew text we use today was compiled more than 1,000 years after the events it describes. They worked from earlier manuscripts, many of which no longer exist. The oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew that has survived is the Codex Leningradensis, dated to 1008 AD. Almost 3,000 years separate that manuscript from the events of the Exodus. 3,000 years of copyists, of translations, of editorial decisions. In that vast interval, how many lines in the great ledger of history might have been altered? Not necessarily through malice. In many cases, it was simply the natural process of textual transmission in the ancient world. An abbreviation here, a clarification there, a well-intentioned interpolation, and suddenly, 430 years becomes an open question. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the arid hills surrounding the Dead Sea in what is now the Palestinian West Bank. He tossed a stone into one of the cliffside caves to startle what he thought might be the animal. Instead of the bleating of a goat, he heard the shattering of pottery. He entered the cave. What he found inside were clay jars, and within the jars, scrolls of parchment wrapped in linen cloth. No one at that moment suspected that this accidental discovery would become one of the most important finds in 20th century biblical archaeology. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as they are now known, contain fragments of nearly every book of the Old Testament. They date from between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, making them approximately 1,000 years older than the Codex Leningradensis. And in some passages, they present variations from the Masoretic Text. Not radical variations, but variations nonetheless. Among the researchers who dedicated their lives to studying these scrolls was John Allegro, a British scholar from the University of Manchester. Allegro was one of the first non-religious academics to be granted access to the original manuscripts in the 1950s, when what he found deeply unsettled him. Not because the texts dramatically contradicted the Bible, but because they revealed something more subtle. The process of textual transmission was far more fluid, far more variable than religious tradition had acknowledged. Scribes did not copy with mechanical precision. They interpreted, they corrected, and sometimes they added. Allegro attempted to publish his findings without academic or institutional filters. In 1970, he published The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, a book that caused a scandal in academic and religious circles. His colleagues at the British Academy published an open letter distancing themselves from his more extreme theories. His academic reputation was damaged. He died in 1988, relatively forgotten. For decades, or his more rigorous contributions to the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls were ignored, tainted by their association with his more controversial works. This is the human cost of certain lines of investigation. It is not always the dramatic censure of an ecclesiastical council. Sometimes it is quieter, a reputation that erodes, a body of work that is shelved, a voice that is no longer heard, and the questions that voice once asked are left floating, without official answer, in the margins of history. There is, of course, a simple explanation for all of this, and it would be dishonest not to mention it. The numbers in the Bible are not always meant to be taken literally. This is the position held by many modern theologians and scriptural scholars. In the literature of the ancient Near East, large numbers often functioned as symbolic markers, while not as precise historical records. The number 40, for instance, appears dozens of times in the Bible. 40 days of rain, 40 years in the desert, 40 days of fasting. Scholars point out that in ancient Hebrew, 40 often signified a long and significant period rather than a literal quantity. Could the same be true of 430? Perhaps some researchers suggest. The number 430 was chosen not because someone had literally counted the years, but because it was a theologically significant number. 430 is 400 plus 30, and 400, in many Semitic numerical systems, represented fullness or totality. The figure could be a way of saying they were there for a sufficient length of time. It is a possible, reasonable, and academically respectable explanation. But then something appears that complicates it. In 1977, the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin published the results of excavations carried out at Hazor, a Canaanite city specifically mentioned in the Book of Joshua as one of the cities conquered during Israel's entry into Canaan. The city had clearly identifiable layers of occupation. But one of these layers showed unmistakable signs of violent destruction. And the date of that destruction, according to carbon-14 analysis, was approximately the 13th century BC. This aligns with the Exodus chronology if we use the literal 430 years in Egypt. But in 1996, a new, more precise analysis of that same archaeological layer was published by Israel Finkelstein, a professor at Tel Aviv University. In his work, The Bible Unearthed, Finkelstein argued that the destruction of Hazor could not be reliably attributed to the Israelites. The evidence, he claimed, pointed to other possible causes: internal Canaanite conflicts, invaders from the Mediterranean Sea, or economic collapse. The same archaeological event. Two completely different interpretations. And here the question returns with greater force. If the numbers are not literal, why do the Septuagint and the Masoretic Text differ by more than 2 centuries? Symbolic variations do not explain such a concrete textual difference between 2 versions of the same verse. One version adds words that the other does not contain. That is not symbolism, it is a modification of the text. And the question is, when did that modification occur, and why? There is another text, one that is rarely mentioned in these discussions: the Book of Jubilees. This is an ancient Jewish text that is not part of the official biblical canon, although it was considered sacred by the Qumran community. The same people who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Book of Jubilees, the story of the patriarchs and the period in Egypt is narrated with a detailed chronology that differs from both the Masoretic Text and the Septuagint. According to Jubilees, the total time from the promise to Abraham until the Exodus was 430 years. But this period includes the time in Canaan and the time in Egypt, and it coherently spans several generations, consistent with the 4-generation genealogy down to Moses. The Book of Jubilees was excluded from the Hebrew canon at the rabbinical councils of the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. The very same councils that determined which texts would be considered sacred and which would be left out. It was not destroyed, simply relegated. It survived in the Ethiopian tradition, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes it in its biblical canon to this day, and in fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This does not mean the Book of Jubilees is more correct than the Masoretic Text. It means something more unsettling. It means that in the 1st century A.D., when definitive decisions were being made about which texts would constitute the Bible and which would not, there were multiple competing traditions in circulation with different chronologies. The chronology we know today is the one that won, but it was not the only one that existed. In 285 BC, according to the tradition preserved in the letter of Aristeas, King Ptolemy II of Egypt commissioned the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. 72 Jewish scholars were gathered in Alexandria to complete the work. The resulting translation, the Septuagint, He became the Bible used by the majority of Jews in the Mediterranean world for centuries. And it was also the Bible used by the first generation of Christians. The New Testament quotes the Septuagint far more frequently than the Hebrew text. So, when Jerome, the Christian scholar who lived from 347 to 420 AD, was commissioned by Pope Damasus I to create a new Latin translation of the Bible, he made a decision that would change history. He chose to work directly from the Hebrew, not from the Greek. His translation, known as the Vulgate, became the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. And in the Vulgate, Exodus 12:40 reads, "Egypt only, not Egypt and Canaan," a translation decision made in the 4th century AD, based on Hebrew manuscripts we can no longer fully verify, was adopted as the official standard and copied for centuries. And when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German in 1522, he did so from the Hebrew Masoretic Text. When the translators of the King James Bible produced their English version in 1611, they did the same. And from English and German came dozens of translations into Spanish, Portuguese, and French. The 430 years in Egypt became the standard for virtually the entire Western Protestant tradition, while the 430 years including Canaan remained in the Greek and Ethiopian traditions. There is one final element worth considering. The Book of Exodus describes the Israelites building the cities of Pithom and Ramesses for the Pharaoh. For decades, archaeologists searched for evidence of massive Semite slave labor in Egypt. In 1885, the Swiss archaeologist Edouard Naville excavated at Tel El Maskuta in the Nile Delta and found ruins he provisionally identified as the city of Pithom. In later decades, excavations in the area of Kontir revealed what many researchers believe could be the site of the city of Ramesses, also known as Pi-Ramesses. The construction dates of Pi-Ramesses coincide with the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BC. But in 1987, the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak, excavating at Tel El Daba, found something different. Beneath the layers from the Ramesside period, he discovered an older city from the Hyksos period, approximately the 18th century BC. And in that older city, he found pottery, domestic architecture, and burial patterns that showed distinctly Semitic, not Egyptian, characteristics. A city inhabited by people of Semitic origin in the Nile Delta, centuries before Ramesses II. Could this be the evidence of the Hebrew settlement in Egypt? And if the Exodus occurred long before Ramesses II, with a chronology that would better fit the 215 years of the Septuagint? Bietak published his findings in multiple volumes through the Austrian Archaeological Institute. He did not claim to have found the city of the Hebrews, but the data he presented is real, documented, and does not fit comfortably with any of the traditional chronologies of the Exodus. Neither the 430 years in Egypt from the Masoretic Text, nor the 215 years derived from the Septuagint. The problem of the 430 years is not a problem that archaeology has solved. It is a problem that archaeology has deepened. When in the basement of the British Museum in London, there is a storage room where thousands of cuneiform tablet fragments are kept, still not fully cataloged or translated. Some come from Mesopotamia, others from Egypt, others from Syria. Each of these fragments is a piece of a story that someone considered important enough to record. Most will never be read, not because it is impossible, but because there are not enough researchers, resources, or time to do the work. From the 1st century to the 21st, the story of the Hebrew people in Egypt has been told through a number: 430 years. That number is in the text that more than 2 billion people in the world consider sacred. And yet, that number changes depending on which version of the sacred text you are reading. It changes depending on which century the manuscript was copied. It changes depending on whether you prefer the Greek, the Hebrew, or the Ethiopian tradition. The 430 years are not a contradiction that destroys the biblical story. They are a window into the complex, imperfect, and profoundly fascinating human process by which sacred texts have come down to us. Through the hands of scribes working by lamplight, through the decisions of translators living in cultures and historical moments vastly different from our own, through councils that debated, voted, and chose. History rarely vanishes all at once. Sometimes it disappears word by word. A preposition added here, a century omitted there. And what remains is an uncomfortable question. When you read those 430 years, are you reading the original text? Or are you reading the latest copy of the latest copy of a decision that someone made 15 centuries ago at a stone desk with a reed pen and insufficient light? We do not have the definitive answer. And that, in itself, is the story. It is part of the story. If this is the kind of historical detective work that fascinates you, then do consider subscribing to the channel. Each week, we explore the very fissures in the historical record, the texts that were almost lost to time, and the questions our school books never thought to ask. History, you see, is always more complicated and infinitely more fascinating than we were ever led to believe.